The four bridges stretching back to 1209 are the Old London Bridge by Peter de Colchurch, the John Rennie Bridge, 1831 to 1973, London Bridge in America, and the current London Bridge. And there are three misapprehensions which I want you to look out for later. No, the Americans knew they were buying London Bridge, not Tower Bridge. It wasn't a con trick done by my father, rest assured. The new London Bridge cost the taxpayer nothing, and the American bridge is only an outer shell. So just a few words about bridges before 1209. There's a general agreement that the first bridge was Roman, probably built something like this, and probably in AD 50, just east of the existing bridge. Julius Caesar had written earlier how they built bridges in these words: two pointed piles, 18 inches thick, were formed into a truss and driven into the riverbed with pile drivers inclined towards the current. Opposite and 40 feet downstream, a similar arrangement leaning into the stream. These were then joined by a transom 2 foot wide, secured to the piles by iron dogs, and diagonal braces fitted between the piles. Additional piles and horizontal timbers fitted to prevent damage by floating tree trunks. That's a pretty good bridge design. So the Roman bridge was almost certainly timber because timber remains have been found on the north bank. The port of Londinium developed on the north bank, and the tide of the Thames enabled seagoing vessels to visit. Also, because this was the lowest bridge on the Thames, it helped the Romans control southern England up to 410 AD. After that, things are uncertain. I don't know if anyone here reads the Bernard Cornwell novels, particularly the Saxon novels with Uhtred, son of Uhtred, but in those novels, in 871 AD, King Alfred the Great's time, there is a reference to a breached London Bridge with a great river flow through the middle. I was puzzled by this, so at vast expense, I contacted Bernard Cornwell, and he believes that this was still the Roman bridge. But it wasn't to last much longer, because in 993, King Olaf of Norway plundered Staines without a bridge anywhere in the way. The next reference to the bridge is thought to be reliable is in the time of Ethelred the Unready. And by the way, unready means ill-counselled in Anglo-Saxon. London was held by the Danes, with a large fortress at Southwark, and a fairly stout timber London Bridge, heavily fortified. Ethelred, supported by Olaf the Norseman, attacked the bridge in 1014 and were initially beaten off, but they tied their ships to the bridge and rowed downstream, taking the bridge with them. This is the first version of London Bridges falling down, the tune, which the Vikings originally conceived. There are three versions, which I won't have time to talk about tonight. It's mentioned again as a whole bridge in William the Conqueror's charters of 1067, swept away in 1091, destroyed by fire in the Great Fire of 1135, far more damaging to London than the later one in 1666. And small wonder then that the city, church and king together decided to invest in a completely new bridge and appointed Peter de Colchurch to be responsible. We're not sure if he was an engineer, but he was the chaplain of St Mary's Church, where Thomas Becket, then the Archbishop of Canterbury, had been baptised. That's why the new chapel on London Bridge would be called St Thomas's. It was a starting point for pilgrims going to Canterbury and would stand on the great pier, resisting the full force of the wind, weather and the river. Peter de Colchurch's bridge would stand for over 600 years and was the only bridge in central London for 540 of those. It took 33 years to build, 10 of those using a wooden construction and then abandoning this for a stone construction. An interesting choice because there wasn't any stone for miles. Remarkably, it was a wonder the bridge got built, because England was strapped for cash at the time as Richard I was fighting the Crusades. So the bridge was financed by a special tax on wool. The construction was inspired, with 19 arches resting on rammed stones, secured in oak and elm palisades and surrounded by boat-shaped starlings, not, as rumour had it at the time, on wool packs. It's not known why Peter the Church chose pointed arches, perhaps his church connections. He may have known the French Pontist religious order who was simultaneously building the famous Pont d'Avignon. However, his bridge created such a barrier to the Thames that there was often a 5-foot level difference, a mini Niagara through every arch, making travel under the bridge an interesting ride to rival today's theme parks. Peter died before the bridge was finished in 1205, and he was interred under the chapel. We will hear more about him in 1830. There's a picture of St. Thomas's Chapel in the centre of the bridge. There was nothing like this bridge in the rest of Europe, with houses and shops ordered by King John to help pay for the upkeep, and such was the greed of the developers that many of the houses were there before the bridge was even open. Their upper stories projected across the street and out across the river to get maximum income, and they were all built of wood. Underneath, the only road into London, barely 12 foot wide, swarming with people and animals and wagons, and underneath the perpetual roar of the water. Imagine the noise, the smells and the congestion. Crossing the bridge could take up to an hour. All the new houses were destroyed by fire within 3 years of their construction, with hundreds killed. There were frequent fires and quick housing replacements for many years to come, until the houses were removed by an Act of Parliament in 1758. Interestingly, you could take 100 rabbits across the bridge for a halfpenny, but £1 of woven cloth from overseas was charged at sixpence, which is about £10 in today's money. This was obviously a punitive tax to protect the English wool trade. These tolls were collected at the Bridge House, near the chapel, and the Bridge House Estates Fund that sprang from this was later to finance the current London Bridge. A couple of shots of the bridge there, and the one at the bottom shows London Bridge before they started sticking any heads on it. So they started sticking heads on the bridge in 1305, the first one being William Wallace, or Braveheart. Other famous heads would include Thomas More in 1535 and Oliver Cromwell in 1540, having been tried just a few hours before for treason after he was dead. A visiting German diplomat in 1598 reported seeing 34 heads on the bridge, by then all at the southern end. I have a picture of that in a moment. About the same time, there's the heads on the southern end of the bridge looking like little pins. About the same time, the northern gate of the bridge was replaced with the beautiful Nonsuch House. And I have to say the photography in 1579 was amazing. What a beautiful picture this is. This was built off-site in Flanders, reassembled on the bridge, and no nails used in the construction. One of the very first prefabricated houses. But, despite being picturesque and famous, the rest of the bridge was very dangerous and very expensive. A whole bridge, complete with occupants, fell off the bridge in 1438. The bridge sank as it got older and heavier, losing its gentle slope up to the middle and ending up flat. And even then, they added corn mills on the bridge in the 16th century and water wheels later, providing piped wheels to Londoners, one of the mills shown there at the bottom left. These all went up in flames in 1633, were rebuilt and lost again in 1666. And by this time, the bridge was so weak that £1,500, a fortune worth at least £1,000,000 in today's prices, was spent shoring it up again. In 1722, to reduce congestion, traffic was ordered to keep left. This good idea was soon to spread to other parts of the UK and is the origin of us driving on the left. Another fire in 1725 caused a rebuild from the foundations at the Southwark end, where there was also a wooden drawbridge. And it's all downhill from then. Nonsuch House had become a shop, and the chapel a paper warehouse. And the opening of Westminster Bridge in 1749 was the death knell of London Bridge. It was wide and spacious with no houses, and they therefore took the houses off London Bridge in short order and widened the centre arch, which the river tore through and ate away. Even then, in 1767, they put another water wheel in, restricting the side flow even further. With vicious frosts in 1768, 1785 and 1789, by the start of the 1800s, the bridge was in total disrepair. See this slide here from 1758, before all those frosts. And one of the waterworks fires in the late 1700s. With vicious frosts, again, the bridge being in total disrepair, see this battering of ice in 1795. William Gifford, in the Quarterly Review of 1814, said, "This pernicious structure has wasted more money on perpetual repairs than would have been sufficient to build a dozen safe and commodious bridges, and has cost the lives, perhaps, of as many as 1,000 people." So, a select committee was formed to improve the Port of London, and as part of that work, a variety of plans for a new bridge were put forward. My favourite was Thomas Telford's Iron Bridge. You can see at the top of this slide. I think this was a step too far for city leaders at that time, and it would have required a lot more space inland as well because it was very high. In 1821, Old London Bridge had an annual income from tolls of £30,000. That's about 600,000 in today's money. And John Rennie's estimate for his bridge was 450,000, or 9 million in today's money. That's actually double what the new bridge, the existing bridge, would later cost. But being as they had that annual income from tolls, it was affordable long term. But in the event, a special toll on coal was introduced to pay for it more quickly. Poor John Rennie Sr. died almost as soon as the work was started. So it was his son, also John Rennie, who actually built the new bridge. It was built 180 feet west of the old bridge, which remained open until the new bridge was completed. You can see the two bridges in the bottom slide in these beautiful engravings by E.W. Cook. The old London Bridge on the left, the new Rennie Bridge on the right. And you can see they didn't have, even then, much construction equipment, just a few wooden cranes. The rest of it was lugged by hand. It was thought that once the old London Bridge was demolished, the increased river flow might sweep away Westminster Bridge and other bridges upstream. And one or two of them did require strengthening as a result, but the worst did not happen. And finally, you remember I said that we would meet Peter de Colchurch again in 1830. Well, it's during the demolition of the old bridge that his bones were found under the chapel, but they were carelessly thrown into the river by a workman. Rennie's bridge was pretty much solid granite and weighed 130,000 tonnes. It took 6 years to build and ran 18 months late. It had a magnificent 53-foot wide roadway, but was so crowded with horse-drawn vehicles, it was said you couldn't cross London Bridge without seeing a white horse. It is also now that the new railways were bringing in large numbers of commuters, so further weight was added to the bridge in 1902 with the addition of the outer footpaths. And look at that scene there with all those commuters and buses on the Rennie Bridge. Although the weight of the bridge would eventually be its downfall, its structure was never to fail. It even survived an anarchist's dynamite explosion in 1884. I'll just briefly mention Nancy's Steps. Down behind that white sign in the centre bottom of this slide was a set of steps going down to the river where you could get onto steamers and things. They were called Nancy Steps because that was where Sykes murdered Nancy in the novel Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist being written in 1838, the bridge was still fairly new and the story was topical. Nancy Steps are still there, but they are buried in the abutments of the new bridge. Rennie's Bridge would last for 142 years. Not as long as its predecessor, but pretty good all the same. I can remember passing under the bridge as a child and seeing the tilt that had developed. And the City Corporation decided that a stabilising and widening of the old bridge was not an option economically, and it was decided to build a new bridge at a cost of £4 million. Although my father's notes said that it ended up at £5.5 million, but we'll gloss over that. The key players would be Mott, Hay and Anderson as consulting engineers for the design and site supervision, William Holford and Partners as architects, and John Molam as the civil engineering contractors. They are now, well, they were Carillion. I'm not sure who's got Carillion now. My father was the City of London's liaison officer, the client in other words, and as the master said, he would later go on to be city engineer a few years later. The work started in 1967. Meanwhile, a unique process was also underway to offer the old bridge, or actually only the elevational stonework, 10,000 tons of it, on a worldwide basis. This would raise £1 million towards the cost of the bridge, and all the rest came from the Bridge House Estates Fund, costing the taxpayer nothing. It's worth noting from this piece of paper, the tender document, that you had to pay $2.4 million for the bridge, and it was pick-up only. It wasn't delivered for that sum. So let's follow the Stones to America. The successful bidder being the McCullough Oil Corporation of Los Angeles, and Mr. McCullough was also the inventor of the chainsaw. His plan was to develop a new resort at Lake Havasu City, Arizona, and surround it with new factories making chainsaws and other products. Every piece of the bridge would be numbered for the second time, and I'll come back to that in a second. I remember seeing correspondence from them with a picture of London Bridge on the top of the letterhead. They knew which bridge they were buying, but possibly the American public did not. A new 5-arch bridge was constructed to the profile of the Rennie Bridge, but built in double cantilevers in an earthquake zone, and designed by the same team as had done the new bridge design in London, led by Michael Leeming, who's a good friend of mine. 12,000 pieces of the Rennie Bridge were shipped 7,000 miles in a 3-year operation. And in the top picture here on the right, that little black thing there, where my arrow is me, and I'm about 15 years old. And I'm helping in the docks at the weekends, putting the stones in the cases. It was discovered that the stones had been numbered once before, by Rennie no less, when the original bridge was built. So a couple more shots in Lake Havasu City. You can see that the bridge was built by forming the bridge over sand because there was no river there. The river was constructed especially for the bridge and the lake behind it. So it's a completely false waterway supporting the centre of Lake Havasu City. And there it is completed. So now back to the current London Bridge, designed on the same centre line as the Rennie Bridge, but this time only weighing 55,000 tonnes. Work started in 1967 and would continue until 1972, but at no time was the main traffic or pedestrian flow stopped. You will see how this was done in a minute. For the civil engineers amongst you, it is a 3-span, pre-stressed, post-tensioned concrete bridge designed as 4 parallel box beams. I have actually walked through it. It was built as 4 bridges joined together and was until recently the only hollow bridge across the Thames. The new foundations are 100 feet below high water and were excavated by hand. They are 26 feet diameter at the base and 12 feet at the top, and of course just alongside was highly stressed clay supporting the existing bridge. It must have been a tricky job. There are 250 miles of wire strand in the bridge, and once again granite has been used on the facings. Its overall width is 107 feet, including 2 30-foot wide carriageways, a bit different to the single 12-foot wide old London Bridge. So how was it built without stopping the traffic? Well, first a gantry was built with 6 spans to take all the construction loads. Londoners speculated that this was how they would have to cross at high level in the cold weather. But first, the upstream footway was taken off the old bridge and the first quarter of the new bridge constructed. We'll see that in a moment, but you can see it just up here in this sketch. Pedestrians went on to the one remaining downstream footway, which was widened at the expense of carriageway width. Then traffic went onto the new quarter bridge and pedestrians onto the carriageway of the old bridge. Same process again on the downstream side of the old bridge, moving the gantry and constructing the second quarter of the new bridge. Then we have pedestrians on this section and traffic on the outer new section, leaving the old bridge in the middle free of all traffic. So there's the gantry shown up there with the buses showing there. And here you can see the 2 quarter bridges on the left and the right, and Rennie's old bridge in the middle. So Rennie's bridge was then demolished half at a time using the steel gantry overhead for the operation. As soon as quarter 3 was finished, southbound traffic went onto that, and finally they joined all the quarters with the construction of diaphragms to complete the bridge. Good picture of the bottom here with a quarter of the new bridge and the old bridge still sitting there. And here's some of the 250 miles of wire and the hollow structure inside. So the bridge was opened in 1973, an amazing project. And in the words of the city engineer at the time, Harold King, I would like to pay a sincere tribute to all those connected with this great enterprise. It seems to be quite strong. HMS Jupiter struck the bridge in 1984 and was far more damaged than the bridge. And who repaired the bridge? Well, the old Bridge House Estates Fund again. There's the completed bridge in 1973. There are more tower blocks now, of course. So that shows its age, that picture. So I'm coming to an end soon, but let's just have a quick word about the Bridge House Estates Fund. It looks after all the city bridges and was a notable contributor to the new Millennium Bridge. It gives substantial amounts to charity and has about £500 million worth of commercial property. Not bad for a toll collecting fund that these days gets nothing from the users of the bridge. And finally, Janet and I, as freemen of the City of London, drove our sheep over London Bridge in 2009, exercising our ancient rights as freemen of the city and celebrating the 800th anniversary of Peter de Colechurch's bridge. A design competition was then proposed with this solution for developing the bridge. Personally, I think it's horrific. I will lead you to decide what you think of it.